The title of today's message is Glory, which is pretty cool that although I would like to take credit that I actually thought of this and did it. I did not do that. But glory is such an interesting word to me, and it has so many different usages. When I think about glory, one of the words that comes to my mind is a movie that was made in 1989 called Glory. It was about the 54th Regiment from Massachusetts that was made up exclusively of black soldiers and a few white officers, which was a big thing in the Civil War. And the thing that they're most known for is a courageous attack near Charleston, South Carolina, on the bay there at Fort Wagner. If you've seen the movie or know something of the history of these guys, they attacked this fort over open, right there along the coast with the water coming up and from the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and the beaches, and it was a heavily fortified fort, and it wasn't a suicide mission, but it wasn't that far from that. But the reason that the filmmakers decided to call it Glory was because there was a question in our country: could black soldiers fight like white soldiers? That was the current kind of big thing, and a lot of people were not too sure about that. But these men who volunteered, of course, they were convinced they could do that, which they did, and they proved that in combat, in battle, and which was shown in that movie. And there was something of, in that sense of glory, something of a sense of the glory of courage and valor and bravery, but also, it was more than that. There was something personal about that. There was something of glory in them that was shown by their courage and valor. When I think of glory also, I'm a big sports guy, and of course the glory of the victory and the Super Bowl. The Eagles won the Super Bowl, and of course, on that, kind of split here. We don't talk about politics or the Super Bowl, I guess, at our church. But afterwards, you saw sort of the glory that the Eagle team, they basked in their glory on the field and during the awards presentation and in the locker room. And then, of course, they had a big parade in Philadelphia where I guess several million people came out to celebrate. And all the players and the coaches were on the buses and the trucks, and they made their way. And they were sort of celebrating the glory of the victory and the glory of what they had accomplished. And then there's something personal about this too, something of that which they had reached for. When I think about glory in another sense, the Latin word, it goes back to worship or value. The Old Testament word means something of weight. Kabod is the Hebrew word, something of weight, or something weighty. And it was used to describe somebody who was very wealthy. They had the weight of riches. Or somebody that had a high position in government, the weight of position. There was something about that brought that person glory or splendor. The Old Testament used it also in terms of Shekinah glory and describing the beauty of God's character. Now, of course, God can't be seen by human eyes, but there were times in the Old Testament, and one we'll see today, where the Shekinah glory was seen, meaning, though God did not literally, fully reveal himself, he revealed something of his nature and character in a way that was visible to human beings. The Shekinah glory. And this was seen in the story that we'll see again today. But the glory of God, fundamentally from a theological point of view, is what Drew just told us. It's something of the nature of God that is perfect. Or it's all of the attributes of God, and every one of them is perfect, and all of them together are complete and perfect. And who God is the glory of God. And what he has done is seen the glory of God. At the cross, you will see the glory of God, and you will see the cross, as we saw a little picture there of the resurrection of Christ. And of course, the redemptive story of God points to God's glory. And one day, all of his people will bow down in worship and humble gratitude at the wonder of what he has accomplished. Now, when I think about our story today, I think about glory, which is the title of today's message. But we have in Mark 9 sort of different glimpses of what glory looks like. And so we're going to kind of take some snapshots through chapter 9. The first picture is the dazzling picture of glory, also known as the Transfiguration. Let's start with Hebrews 1:3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory. So if there's been any question about the deity of Christ up until this point for the disciples, this is the place at which that door should be closed, although it wasn't for them. They're kind of like us. They're kind of slow to come along. But Hebrews says the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, meaning the cross, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. All of these are word pictures or descriptions of the equality of God the Father and God the Son. Jesus Christ, fully human, fully divine. Now let's look at our story in Mark 9. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led him up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. Transfigured in the Greek word comes from the word metamorphosis, sort of the changing of nature. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses who were talking with Jesus. Now, Mark doesn't tell us what they were talking about, but Luke tells us that they were discussing the cross, the unfinished business of redemption, of which Moses and Elijah had pointed to for 1,400 years and 900 years. The unfinished business, and they were excited about what was to come. Verse 5. Peter said to Jesus, while this is going on, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters," or the word is tabernacles, "one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Oh, he kind of put his foot in his mouth here. Just something needs to be said. I don't know what to say. But it says they were so frightened. And in the Greek word means terrified. Now try to put yourself in this situation. You're at the top of this mountain. You've walked up there with Jesus, and suddenly the whole picture of Jesus is different. There is something glorious. What you see about him is completely different. It still looks like him in his humanity, but there's something about his deity that is overwhelming. And then suddenly you realize that one guy that's been dead 1,400 years, and another guy that's been dead 900 years, is now standing there, sort of the superstars of the Old Testament, and they're having a discussion with Jesus. I think I would have been terrified too. Certainly would not have understood what was going on, and I would not have known what to say. And I probably would have blurted out something just as stupid as Peter did. Let's make 3 tabernacles. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them. A voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." And then in that moment, suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Now, if you study the Old Testament, I'm sure that you relate this to Moses being up on the mountain, and God spoke to him audibly. A cloud came down, and Moses was in awe as God was meeting with him. And during the time of Moses, anytime he would be with God in God's presence like this and come back down on the mountain or come out of the tabernacle, the people remarked about the reflection of Moses' face. He had this aura about him of being in God's presence, the Shekinah glory of God. But there's one big difference between Moses' experience on the mountain and the experience with Jesus on the mountain. For Moses, he reflected the glory of God, But to Jesus on the mountain, he was the glory of God. And these fellows had a chance to see that. Now, when I think about Peter wanting to build some shelters or tabernacles, the tabernacles in the Old Testament represent this sort of makeshift place where sin can be atoned for, where you can go and confess your sins. And although he said maybe we should make some tabernacles, Jesus did not take him up on that. And I think, well, how come? Because the tabernacle for sin to be dealt with was standing right in front of them. Well, maybe there should have been some priests who could have come along and taken and done a sacrifice for sin for Peter, James, and John. But the priest was also standing in front of them. Well, maybe some sacrifice for sin should be here. But again, the sacrifice of sin, the sacrifice, was also standing in front of them. There's sort of this dazzling vision, this dazzling picture of glory that's really hard to encompass in words or pictures. But something of this, I think, is with Jesus fully human and fully divine, something of the humanity side of him, like a veil, was pulled away. And for a brief few moments, these guys had a chance to see more clearly the deity side of Jesus, or the deity part of his nature, the divine part of his nature. And there's something that happens there. Again, it's hard to put words to or put your finger on. But I think there's something of several things, and one I want to mention here is these three men were drawn to God in a way that was unique. There's something about an image or a vision that draws them and that makes them hungry for what God has to give them. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Weight of Glory, has a great way of putting, he wrote a paragraph about this that I really like. It's in your handout. He says, the sense that in this universe, we as people are treated as strangers. We don't really feel at home. There's something not quite right. There's a longing to be acknowledged. We enjoy that with relationships. But even the best of that is not quite enough. To be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality is part of our inconsolable secret. And surely, from this point of view, the promise of glory becomes highly relevant to our deepest desire. And this is what C.S. Lewis sees in this particular picture of the Transfiguration. Glory means good relationship with God, acceptance by God, response from him, acknowledgement from him, and welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we have been knocking all our lives will open at last. And then our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel at least partially cut off. To be on inside of some door, which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. There's something of this picture of transfiguration that for those three men and for you and I 2,000 years ago draws us onward to something of which we want to be a part. Well, this is the dazzling picture of glory. But then, strikingly, there's the death of glory in a sense. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Jesus had started talking about his upcoming suffering and the need for him to die on the cross and for resurrection, and the disciples were hopelessly lost in that idea. That's not what they anticipated the Messiah was going to do or Jesus was going to do. But he comes back to it again and says this again. Verse 10, they kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. Now, it's easy for us on this side of history to look back and go, how could those guys have missed this? However, if you and I had been there, this would have been completely outside the box of our understanding. Rise from the dead, because in our experience, we would have never seen that. That would have made no sense to us in life anyway, but especially with him, because everybody expected he was going to overthrow the Romans and bring power back to Jerusalem and the nation of Israel. They asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? They're thinking about Old Testament prophecy. They're thinking about what is it he's come to do. And they're thinking about Malachi, where this prophecy comes from. Verse 12, Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. And then Jesus says, why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. Now, this is confusing to us, and it was confusing to those guys in real time as they heard this. To them, and if you were an Old Testament person, the day of the Lord was the day when God finally comes to punish sin and all of the injustices that have been done and all the need for validation and justice to happen will finally happen, that which we long for. But the day of the Lord also involves his justice and his wrath. And so when the prophecy in Malachi says that Elijah is going to come, it looks forward to that day when everything that's been made wrong will finally be made right. But Jesus says you've got the right prophecy, but the wrong Elijah, or the wrong idea of Elijah. There is an Elijah, but not the Elijah you're thinking of. There is the picture of Elijah, or an analogy of Elijah that's being talked about here. Years ago, I remember when the Boston Celtics had this long reign of just a dynasty in the NBA. Larry Bird and Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale and some of those, Danny Ainge, they all retired. And the Celtics became just another sort of regular team, pretty bad. And Rick Pitino was the coach. And I'll never forget one of these press conferences. Do you remember what I'm going to say?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So Rick Pitino's in there, and the reporters are giving him a hard time because the team is doing so poorly. And he says to them, listen, fellas, to the reporters, Larry Bird is not coming back through that door. Kevin McHale is not coming back through that door. Robert Parrish is not coming back through that door. Now, he was speaking here literally about those three men, but now that they're retired, even if they came back at their age, that would not help the team. But he was using the analogy of a Larry Bird person, a Robert Parrish person, a Kevin McHale type person is not going to come walking through that door. And something of that same usage here is what Jesus is saying. You're right to think about Elijah coming, and the real Elijah is going to will precede the day of the Lord. He's the forerunner of that. But the Elijah I'm thinking about in analogy form or allegory form, this Elijah has come. And they've executed him. He's talking about John the Baptist, the forerunner, his forerunner. They've executed him. And he's saying here is that in the same way that the real Elijah is a forerunner, his coming was a forerunner to the coming of the Lord, this figurative Elijah, meaning John the Baptist, was executed and is a forerunner of and a picture of his execution, the execution of Jesus. Now, that's the death of glory. It's what he's trying to help these guys see. Put one of the prophecies together. Now, the third thing that strikes me about this is that there's a vision of glory as these men look at this transfiguration. And when I think about this, I think about that Jesus had just been talking to the disciples clearly and repeatedly and in detail about his upcoming suffering and the cross and the resurrection. Now, Jesus was fully divine, but he's also fully human. And he knows that it's just a matter of months before this plays out. and it's going to be very, very ugly and painful. The greatest amount of suffering any person has ever gone through. Now, to try to put yourself in his shoes, imagine this has gone on. You've gone to the doctor because you've had some issues and you've had some tests run. You go in to get your test run, and you sit across the desk, and the doctor's got a sad look on his face. I'm sorry to tell you, but you have cancer. And you'd just be shell-shocked if you heard that. Cancer. Well, how bad is it, doc? And the doctor tells you it's terminal. Well, isn't there something that can be done? And the doctor tells you not really anything that you'd want done. It might buy you another few weeks or so, but not how you want to finish your life. Well, how long do I have, doc? I said, well, the cancer's all through your body. I estimate you have maybe 4 or 6 weeks. Now, that would be a stunning thing. As you walked out of the doctor's office, you would be rattled. And what would you want to know at that point? So you get in your car and you drive home. What are you going to tell your wife? What are you going to tell your kids? There's something in you that wants to be anchored, even though at the same time you feel rattled. So when I think about this thing of the Transfiguration, why does God choose this particular time in the ministry of Jesus to display the glory of Christ? And it appears to me that as Jesus is putting words to his coming suffering and his death and resurrection, that what the Father is doing for the Son is to give him a vision of what's to come. Anchor yourself in the midst of your suffering because of what is going to come. There's something of, in the wonder of Christ transfigured, something of a picture of this is what the pre-human Christ looked like. The glory of Christ, of God. And in this picture, this is the glory that's going to come after the resurrection. And when the redemptive story, the central point of the cross is accomplished and people start populating after repenting at the cross in that day. And it's almost as if God is saying to the Son, I see what you're going to go through. Keep your eyes on that, the glory to come. Anchor yourself in the redemptive story. Hebrews 12 says, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated on the right hand of God. That's how he endured. There's something anchored there, but God gives him a vision, a picture. The dazzling picture of God, of glory, the death of glory, the vision of glory. There's two more, the power of glory. After the four of them come back down the mountain, they come back into the horrors of real life and sort of the evil that's going on. Verse 14, they came to the other disciples, the other 9. They saw a large crowd around them and teachers of the law arguing with them. And there's 3 groups of people they come down to. A large crowd, the populace. There's a smaller group of the teachers of the law, the religious leaders, and then there's the other 9 disciples. And when Jesus walks into this, the 9 disciples are arguing with the teachers of the law. In a big mess, big drama. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Jesus sort of keeps walking over where the disciples and teachers of the law are, and he asks this question, what are you arguing with them about? And then a man in the crowd interrupts before the disciples can say. He said, teacher, I brought you my son. So here's the 4th person in the group that they come down to is the father, and the 5th is his son. The son is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. Now, there's a great painting in the Renaissance done by Raphael, which tries to depict something of the completeness of the scene that we've read about in Mark chapter 9. So at the top you have his depiction of the Transfiguration with Jesus and Moses and Elijah. You have the three disciples there right under them, sort of cowering in fear, frightened, terrified. Then you have the crowd in the scene below. You have the disciples arguing with the teachers of the law. And over here on the right-hand side, in the green, you have the Father and his Son, who's kind of, we would say, out of control, also in that picture. All of this scene, as they come back down the mountain, has all different sort of facets of evil to it, and how this is not supposed to be how the world works. Now, when you think about demonic activity, it's something that in our Western world we don't really talk too much about. And on one extreme, in some places, well, everything is a demon. I remember Flip Wilson when I was a kid, a comedian, the devil made me do it. And then there's the other extreme over here where there's no demonic activity and no Satan. And the actuality is that there is demonic activity, and there's probably more than we're aware of, because Satan comes as an angel of light. He whispers to us. He rarely shows us his cards. He is quite subtle and quite an enemy. Verse 19, "O unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," the father answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And Jesus' response to the father, he says, "If you can?" Or a rhetorical question, meaning, of course, Jesus could do something like this if that was the Father's plan. Everything is possible for him who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the evil spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you to come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse down on the ground that many said, "He's dead." Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind of can come out only by prayer." Now, there are several things that strike me about this story. I want to mention 5 of them. Number 1 is the disciples and teachers of the law all underestimated the power of evil. And number 2, they overestimated their ability to deal with that. That's easy to do if you find that you have drama in your marriage. It's easy to underestimate the power of evil. And it's easy to overestimate your ability to fix things. Or if you're dealing with a teenager that's out of control. Or if some of you are dealing with some just awful work situations. It's easy to underestimate the power of evil and overestimate our ability to do something. But the thing that strikes me the most is this last part, what I think of as the wonder of glory. And God's amazing, I don't know if humility is the right word, or maybe condescension, that he will put the bar of fellowship with him so low that seemingly anybody can step over that bar if they will. And this is pictured in the father's response. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Now this is contrasted with the teachers of the law and the disciples, none of whom acknowledge their inability to deal with this situation. The only one that acknowledges that he cannot deal with a situation is the father. And it's almost as if the father is saying, I'm up against a situation where I'm clearly over my head. I do not have the spiritual power or moral ability to do something to help my son. I am utterly bankrupt. And it's almost like Jesus says, Oh, good. We finally landed where we're supposed to land. Now, theologians call this saving faith. I cannot save me. In this case, I cannot save my son. At our church, we call what the Father is displaying here brokenness. This is not a negative thing. This is a positive thing. It ushers him into the presence of God and opens the door to the power of God. Now, the last thing I want to say about this particular, the example of the Father, I do believe help me overcome my unbelief. For me, that's good news to me. Because what he doesn't say to the Father is, oh my gosh, yes, you are spiritually bankrupt and you're a mess and you have about that much faith. Why don't you go enroll in Bible school for a couple years? Get in a good discipleship program. Find a good church. Get involved. Do some service. Maybe rise to leadership. Maybe take a year and go to the seminary. Then come back and see me. Maybe I could do something about your son. He doesn't say any of that. It's almost like the bar is so low. And finally somebody said, that's where I am. Where it's almost as if Jesus or God said, great. Now we can get rolling. Now, what is it about, I've tried to think about what it is about the Father's attitude, and I have it boiled down to two words. Repentant helplessness. Repentant helplessness. Repentant helplessness. Peter, years later, when he writes his two epistles, thinks back about this event in the second letter, chapter 1, verse 16 to 18. Listen to what Peter says, thinking back upon this event on the mountain. We did not follow cleverly devised tales when we have made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. But we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, such an utterance as this was made to him by the majestic glory, God the Father. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Verse 18, and we ourselves heard this utterance made from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain. This image that we've looked at today was meant to anchor Jesus in his redemptive story. And it was meant to anchor those three disciples in the days and weeks and years that followed after the resurrection. But it's also meant to anchor you and me in the difficulties we go through, and sometimes of just awful suffering. The times when we wonder, it looked like God was going to come through and it looked like great things were going to happen, and instead things have gotten worse. We have an image that anchors us. The image of Christ on that mountain. Robert Louis Stevenson talks about being on a steam liner years ago, and they were in rough seas, and there were a bunch of passengers down in the main dining room, and they were petrified. They were afraid that the ship was going to go down at sea. And one of the men broke the rule. He decided to go up to see the captain up at the top, and he went up there where he's not supposed to be, and he saw the face of the captain steering the boat. And the captain noticed that the man's face was filled with anxiety and fear. The captain realized the moment, and all he did was he smiled at the man. A picture. The man went back down to where all most of the passengers were in the trying to eat, and they all asked him, "What did the captain say?" And the man said, "I saw the face of the captain, and all will be well." Let's pray together. Father, probably all of us have our issues of difficulty and hardship and suffering, sometimes just some excruciating pain, unfinished business, things which we just want to wrap up. And yet sometimes these things go on and on and on. And we are called to an endurance and a perseverance and a patience that far exceeds how we think, what should be, and our own ability. And in those moments, those are moments where you desire us to see, to look for something different. Not a resolution to our problems, but to see the face of Christ in such a way that anchors us, no matter whether the problems in our life get resolved in our lifetime or not. But the point then is to reflect the glory that we experience as we seek you to others who are also going through times of difficulty and pain and heartache and unanswered questions. Please allow us to be anchored in the same way that Peter and James and John were that day and Jesus was that day. And bring back that vision of glory. The day that is coming when all of us step out of this world and into the next, those who know your name.
We at Pacific Church of Irvine invite you to join us every Sunday at 9:30. You can also visit our website at pacificchurch.com.